Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 2. The one enthroned in the heavens laughs. The Lord mocks them. But I have poured out my King on Zion, my holy mountain. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. I hereby father you today. Ask me, and I will make nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your property." Psalm 2 is about God's plan to crush rebellion on the earth. He has appointed his king, whom he has placed on Zion, and that king will rule over all the earth. A helpful way to remember Psalm 2 is part of God's decree, where he speaks of my king on Zion. The authority this king holds comes from heaven to Mount Zion, and then extends even further to all the earth. We've tried to show this flow of authority with the arrows in the icon. This psalm is like a miniature drama about kings on earth, the king in heaven, and the focus of this psalm, God's chosen king on Zion, the place where heaven meets earth. Psalm 2 has 4 sections, each focusing on one of these kings. Each of these kings also has a speech in Psalm 2, which helps to structure the psalm as a whole. First, the earthly kings announce their rebellion against God and his anointed one. The psalmist reports what they announce with contempt and speaks scornfully about their decision to rebel. Second, the heavenly king, God, also responds with contempt for their rebellion. The psalmist expresses awe because God completely dismissed the rebellious king's complaint. Then, in the third section, God's anointed king announces God's decree. The king speaks with confidence that God's decree will stop any rebellion. And in the final section, the psalmist's voice comes again, giving the rebels an ultimatum, which is a final warning that if they do not stop rebelling, they will be destroyed. Once again, the psalmist's words show contempt for any person who would dare to rebel against God. In the ancient world, not all kings were equally powerful. Some kings were stronger because they ruled over a large number of people. Weaker kings would serve more powerful kings. In Psalm 2, the kings of earth rebel against the king of heaven and the king he has anointed to represent him. The kings of earth are hoping to avoid serving God and his chosen king. The king of heaven is not impressed. He mocks them and reminds them that he has already appointed his chosen king and they must serve him. The king God appointed, the king on Zion, then reminds the earthly kings of the decree when God first appointed him to inherit all the nations. God's decree is the reason why the anointed king can be confident that his kingdom will ultimately succeed. And it is why he warns the nations to submit to God and to him before it's too late. Let's look at a little background. In the ancient world, it was common for the most powerful kings, like the kings of Egypt or Mesopotamia, to claim that their God gave them universal dominion or control over everyone else. They made dominion over other lands and people official through treaties, which are royal agreements between kings. The most powerful king, called a suzerain, would have authority over less powerful kings, called vassals. The vassals would be responsible to pay tribute or taxes by giving valuable things to the suzerain, and to fight with their armies when the suzerain needed help fighting his enemies. In return, the suzerain would be responsible to protect the vassals. It was also common for these vassals, or lesser kings, to rebel against their suzerain. This psalm pictures all the kings of the earth as vassals of the Lord, who's put his chosen king in Zion to represent him in the role of suzerain and to rule over all the vassals. Vassals would rebel when they thought the suzerain was vulnerable, such as when a ruler had just become king and he had not yet been tested and proven powerful. This explains the connection between when the kings rebelled and the anointing. The Lord has anointed his chosen king on Zion. That is, he has formally appointed his king through a ritual, including pouring oil on his head. But the earthly kings, the vassals, are hoping to take this opportunity to rebel before the new king proves how powerful he is. Psalm 2 is not surprising because it describes a rebellion or a king's claim to rule everything. In ancient times, both those situations were common. What is surprising is that God chose to place his king on Zion. Zion, or Jerusalem, was the capital city of Israel, and Israel was not a powerful nation. The stories of Israel defeating Egypt and then the Amorite kings Og and Sihon made Israel briefly well known among the surrounding nations. But later, in the time of the Judges, no one considered Israel to be an important or powerful nation that should rule over other nations. To claim that God, the King of Heaven, had chosen the Israelite king, the king on Zion, as his representative, would either be a ridiculous claim that would make people laugh in disbelief, or a prophecy that nobody could have predicted. The psalmist's attitude of total confidence in Israel's king and his dominion over everyone else prepares the listener for what is to come in this psalm. This confidence is why the psalmist can laugh at the idea that it's even possible for other kings to successfully rebel. It all depends on God's decree that he has appointed his king on Zion as the king over all other kings. His king is the suzerain, and the other kings are the vassals. And this confidence explains why the psalmist can issue a poetic ultimatum or threat. All nations must submit to God's anointed king, or they will perish because of their rebellion. A unique feature of Psalm 2 is all the speeches included in the poem. All the characters get to speak for themselves. The earthly kings rebelling in the first section, God, the heavenly king, laughing about their rebellion in the second section, and the king on Zion announcing the decree about his inheritance in the third section. The first three sections all contain speeches. The third section even includes God's speech as a quotation within his anointed king's speech. Only the last section does not directly quote someone, which makes the section stand out poetically. Breaking the poetic pattern raises the question, how will the nations respond to God's decree and the ultimatum that all must obey him or they will be destroyed? Will they continue to rebel and end up crushed? Or will they choose to submit? The psalm ends without their speaking and without answering the question. In the ancient world, when a great king would conquer a new territory and then return home, he would choose a representative to rule the conquered land for him. Sometimes he would set up an image, a statue or a monument, such as the victory stele of Esarhaddon. This image represented King Esarhaddon's presence and authority over the place where the image stood, reminding the people Esarhaddon still ruled. The image reminded everyone they needed to obey the king, even when he was gone. This concept of an image reminding people to obey was also applied to idols. The images of gods, or idols, represented the god's presence and authority over a specific area on earth. The images of human kings were usually made of stone, but images of gods were often made of metal by a process called casting the image, where a craftsman would pour out liquid metal into a mold so that it would harden in the shape they desired. People believed that these images contained the spirit of the god, or that they were a place for the god to live. Here, in Psalm 2, God speaks of pouring out the metal for his own image to describe the relationship between his anointed king and himself. His king represents his presence and authority in the land in the same way that a cast image is intended to represent a god. The historical context and the imagery of casting an image combines two ideas that people understood. First, cast images represented a god on earth. And second, kings left images to represent them in the lands they conquered and ruled. Here in Psalm 2, the anointed king represents God in two ways. Just like cast images were the representative of a god on earth, the king is the representative of the Lord as God. And, just like human kings left images behind, the king is the representative of the heavenly king over his conquered lands. As we will see, the anointed king is also the heir who would inherit God's kingdom. We'll now walk through the text in more detail, section by section.
Why are the nations in an uproar? And why would peoples plot emptiness? Why would earthly kings take a stand? And why have rulers conspired together against the Lord and against his anointed one? Let's tear off their bonds and throw their ropes away from us.
Verses 1 to 3 begin the psalm with a scene of the whole world rebelling. Less powerful kings, the vassals, rebel against a more powerful ruler, the suzerain. During the Israelite monarchy, there were many accounts of kings celebrating that they stopped their vassals who tried to rebel. The ability to stop a rebellion confirmed that the king was chosen by the gods. If a king failed to stop a rebellion of vassals, people would question whether he was chosen by the gods after all. The Lord and his anointed one refer to God and the king God has chosen. The anointed one was already king when the vassals rebelled, which lets us know that these rebel kings already knew about the decree that the psalmist reports later in verses 7 to 9. The rebels hope that the God who chose this king is not as powerful as their own gods, so they're rebelling to test both the power of the king and the God who chose him. The psalmist's attitude toward the rebellion becomes clear when he asks the question in verse 1 without expecting an answer. Why are nations in an uproar, and why do peoples plot emptiness? The nations and peoples refer to the other kingdoms, the vassal kings who have come together to plan a rebellion. They've succeeded in making many people angry, stirring up an uproar. But the poem makes it clear from the start that this uproar is all only emptiness. Their hopes to escape God's rule are completely pointless. The rhetorical question, why rebel, expresses the psalmist's contempt for the nations. The psalmist is fully convinced that their rebellion is pointless and certain to fail. The words the psalmist chooses to open the verse, in an uproar and plot, describe the nations like a storm in the distance that's becoming more powerful and coming closer. In verse 2, the speech the earthly kings give leaves no doubt about who the suzerain is and against whom these kings are planning to rebel. The suzerain is the Lord and his representative, his anointed one. The anointed one refers to the anointed king of Israel, who is specially chosen by God to lead his people. The rebel vassals use the imagery of bonds and ropes that tie them up to complain about God's rule. They compare the rules that are set by the great king, God, to ropes that tie them up like slaves. They do not want to submit to God's anointed king and obey him, so they want to rip off the restraints and throw away the ropes. They're rebelling with everything they have, totally rejecting God's authority over them. They no longer want to be vassals to the suzerain.
The one enthroned in the heavens laughs. The Lord mocks them. Then he speaks to them in his anger and dismays them in his wrath. But I have poured out my king on Zion, my holy mountain.
In verses 4 to 6, the scene shifts to heaven, and we see God's response to the rebel kings and their plan to rebel. All 4 sections of this psalm describe scenes in different locations. Both the first and fourth sections are scenes on earth, and are addressed to earthly kings. But this second section gives the response of the heavenly king, so this scene is set far above the earth. When we come to the third section, the scene happens where heaven and earth meet on Zion. But now for the scene in heaven. The one enthroned in the heavens, the heavenly king, God, is not even impressed with the rebellion the earthly kings are planning. He laughs, in fact. He's not laughing because he is amused or joyful. Instead, he laughs because he is angry and not intimidated, and he is mocking the earthly kings. The Lord laughs because the plan for the wicked vassals to rebel will never succeed. He can already see that their plans will fail. No matter how hard the earthly kings try to get free from his authority, there is no way they will ever succeed. God mocks their plans, but he's also angry that they plan to rebel, which sets the tone for the rest of the psalm. He will not be merciful to those who rebel, but will respond angrily because they refuse to obey him. God will not ignore them, but when they rebel, he will respond with the wrath of a suzerain when a vassal obeys. If a suzerain tolerated disobedience, he would quickly lose his kingdom. But if a suzerain responded quickly and confidently when people disobeyed, he would strengthen his kingdom. God acts quickly and confidently. He does not respond by doing something new, however. Instead, he reminds the rebels of what he has already done. He has already appointed his own king, his own image, whom he has poured out on Zion, just like a craftsman pours out liquid metal into a mold to make an image. In the same way, kings would leave an image in the land they conquered to represent their presence and authority. God leaves his king on Zion to represent God's presence and authority. But God's representative is a living image, not made of metal like a cast image, but made of flesh. God places this image on Zion, the city of David, God's holy mountain. This was the place heaven and earth met. So placing the image on Zion represents God directly interacting with humans on earth. At this meeting place, Zion, his image represents that the heavenly king is present and ruling on earth.
I will tell about the decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. I hereby father you today. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your property. You will crush them with an iron scepter. You will smash them like clay pottery."
The third section of the psalm, verses 7 to 9, tells us more about this chosen king and what the Lord has decreed about him. The psalm does not formally introduce the anointed king as the speaker, but it is clear he's the one speaking because he reports the decree in which the Lord calls him his own son. One feature of Psalm 2 is that the psalmist doesn't always clearly identify the difference between the Lord, the heavenly king, and the Lord's anointed king. It's not always entirely clear which one is doing what. This may be a poetic way of showing they act as one. The Father is like the Son, and the Son is like the Father. The Son represents the Father and shows everyone what the Father is like. The first hint of this blurring of identities is here in this third section. At first, we would expect that the heavenly king is still speaking, but then we realize it's his anointed king who is speaking instead. The first words the anointed king speaks declare the decree of the king. This is the entire job of the anointed king, to represent the heavenly king on earth. He does not speak for himself. He says what God would say. He responds to the rebellious kings, speaking for God. He reminds them of what God already did. The decree begins with this first statement, "You are my son. I hereby father you today." This decree is more than just a description of reality. It actually establishes the relationship between father and son. By saying this, God officially claims the king as his son. This creates a new legal relationship between the Lord and his anointed king by using the language of family relationships. This language of establishing family relationships was the language used when making covenants. Throughout the Old Testament, God would often say of Israel, "I will be their God, and they will be my people." This is the official language that creates a legal relationship in which the two parties have responsibilities to one another they must keep. Here, there is similar language, but instead of the relationship between God and people, the relationship is between father and son. When God calls this king his son, it means several things. First, God is claiming an official relationship. God made a covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7. There, he promised to make David and his descendants kings forever, and he gave the king the responsibility to represent the heavenly king, his father, on earth. David and his descendants have an official job as God's representative king. Second, this son resembles his father. They have similar characters and act in similar ways. The son repeats his father's words, shares his interests, and even gets angry at the same things as his father. The more the son resembles the father, the harder it can be to tell who is speaking and acting, the father or the son. And third, God will treat the king like a father treats a son. He will both take care of him and discipline him like a parent. That part of the relationship becomes important in later psalms, such as Psalm 6. That relationship is already clear because of the relationship between father and son announced here. The relationship between father and son becomes obvious in verse 8. God gives the son the responsibility of asking, and he takes upon himself the responsibility of giving his son an inheritance from among the nations. In the ancient world, the oldest son inherited the father's property when the father died. In this relationship between God and the chosen king, however, the father does not die. Instead, the son must ask for the inheritance. This becomes a pattern we see in the rest of the Psalms, especially in the Psalms David wrote. The psalmist, David, asks God for help, and God responds by rescuing him or helping him win battles. Each victory brings David one step closer to receiving all of the nations as his complete inheritance. The nations choose what kind of relationship they will have with God's anointed king. If they choose to rebel, they will be punished severely. They will be crushed with an iron scepter and smashed like clay pottery. This is strong language. A scepter is a rod or staff that an ancient king held as a symbol of his royal rule over his kingdom. Iron was a symbol of something strong, and clay pots were a symbol of something easy to break. When something of iron hits something made of clay, everyone knows what happens. And when clay pots shatter, no one can put them back together. What this warning means for the nations is plain. If they continue to rebel, they will be defeated, shattered like bits of pottery, with no hope of repairing the damage. They will never succeed in rebelling against God.
And now, kings, wise up, accept discipline, earthly rulers. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, or else he will become angry, and you will perish in your way. For his anger quickly ignites. Happy are all who take refuge in him.
But the nations do not have to end up like shattered clay pots. The final section, the threat or ultimatum in verses 10 to 12, is a reminder that the nations still have a choice. Although God mocks the kings for trying to rebel, and God is determined to crush those who rebel against him, he and his king are not happy about destroying the nations. They want the nations to willingly submit to the most powerful king. But they will force the vassals to submit if they refuse to do it willingly. In this last section, the psalmist offers one final chance for the rebel kings to obey God and his anointed. He warns them that at any point judgment and destruction might come for their rebellion. The nations are in danger, and the psalmist warns them to change before it is too late. They have a chance to learn from God's rebuke and make good decisions, so they will not be crushed and not perish. Earlier in the psalm, the heavenly king and the psalmist mocked the earthly kings for the foolishness of their plans to rebel. Now, God's anointed king calls them to do the opposite, to be wise instead of foolish. And now, kings, wise up! Accept discipline, earthly rulers. What would it look like for the kings to change from being foolish to being wise and to accept discipline? It means to serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. The only way for the kings to avoid being destroyed is if they submit to the Lord and his anointed king. The poetry highlights the change God is asking for by repeating the same sounds from the king's initial angry words of rebellion. But at the end of the poem, the sounds are in words that express submitting and obeying. The poetry offers the nations a chance to exchange their angry words that talk of rebellion for words that are joyful, but also filled with reverent fear and trembling, words that show they submit to a high king, honoring his decree. Honoring the Lord means honoring his anointed king. Kissing someone was a gesture that meant the person was submitting. It was a way for vassals to show honor to the suzerain. The earthly kings would show that they submit to the Lord and his Son by kissing the Son, since the king is the image the Lord has poured out to represent his rule. The verbal form may command repeated kissing, which would be a sign of great respect, the kind of respect the kings of earth would owe to the anointed one of the King of Heaven. The phrase kiss the Son includes an Aramaic word, bar, so the phrase stands out against the Hebrew in the rest of the psalm. Aramaic was an international language people spoke in the region at the time, and Aramaic words are often used in the Old Testament, such as the verb be in an uproar in verse 1 and crush in verse 9. Using an Aramaic word shows that it is not just the Hebrew-speaking world that should recognize the king as God's son. He's also to be recognized as God's son for the international world. All the nations can show they submit to his authority by kissing him. As verse 12 continues, the words express anger, but it's not entirely clear who is angry, the Lord or the anointed king. Since it is the king's job to make sure justice is done, and he was the last person mentioned, it makes sense that the king is angry, mirroring how God was angry in verse 5. The Son is acting like the Father, showing that he is truly a living image who represents God faithfully. The fact that it is hard to tell who the psalmist is talking about, God or his chosen king, is likely a poetic feature, blurring their identities until it is difficult to separate the two. Expressing anger also emphasizes how serious the warning is and how severe the consequences will be if the rebel kings ignore it. God gave all his authority to the chosen king, and if rebelling kings make him angry, he won't show mercy. He'll be quick to destroy them. The role of a suzerain when vassals rebelled required he become angry quickly. Both God and his king are angry about the rebellion. But they're not angry because their emotions are out of control. They're angry at the rebelling kings for a good reason. They know a strong king must keep order in the kingdom, and that requires that vassal kings respect their responsibilities to the suzerain and submit to him. The rebellious kings have two choices. They can either take the angry punishment from the king, or they can submit and take refuge in this king. The image of refuge refers to a suzerain protecting a vassal with a strong army because they have a treaty. If a vassal had the protection of a powerful suzerain, he would not need to be afraid of an enemy invading. even if that enemy were also a very powerful king. This choice between punishment or protection is an invitation to return to the treaty that defines the suzerain and vassal relationship, which requires the less powerful kings, the vassals, to submit, and the more powerful king, the suzerain, to protect. Submitting to the king does not mean serving him with no reward. Instead, submitting to him comes with the reward that the suzerain will protect and care for the less powerful vassals. The powerful king desires two things: to crush those who insist on rebelling, and to protect those who submit to him, who serve him. The end of Psalm 2 is very similar to the beginning of Psalm 1, the very beginning of the Psalter. Happy is the one. In Psalm 1, the person to be celebrated is the one who rejects the path of the wicked and delights in the instruction of the Lord. The path of the wicked leads to death, but the Lord watches over and protects the path of the righteous person. In Psalm 2, the psalmist urges the people who are pursuing wicked plans to stop those plans and instead find protection from the anointed king of the Lord. If they do submit, then they too will be celebrated. We now see the full drama described in this psalm. The kings on earth are rebelling, but the heavenly king responds by laughing at how hopeless their rebellion is. His decree is that his king on Zion is prepared to crush any rebellion. This king on Zion is the Lord's own Son, the image he has poured out like a craftsman making an image of a god to represent his authority and presence on earth. God has declared that this chosen king on Zion is the representative suzerain over all the kings of earth. He has the authority to crush the rebelling kings and the right to receive the inheritance. He only needs to ask, and God will fulfill his decree. The anointed king's role is to carry out the responsibilities of God, crushing rebellious vassal kings and protecting obedient vassal kings. Consequently, the psalmist gives the rebellious nations a choice: either stop planning to rebel and faithfully serve the Lord, or you will perish. These are the only two options. We noted that each of the first three sections ends with a speech. The first section ends with the rebels' speech in verse 3. The second section ends with God's speech to the rebels in verse 6. And the third section ends with God's speech to his anointed king in verses 7 to 9. People might expect the fourth section to follow the pattern and also end with a speech in which the rebels reply. But it doesn't, and now we can understand the reason the psalmist does this. Since we do not hear from the rebels, we're left wondering what their reply will be. Since this psalm was used by Israel as part of their regular worship ceremonies, the people would understand that the ultimatum still stands. The people of Israel would be confident that all the nations would one day serve their God or perish. We will now finish with a dramatic reading of the text that pulls all of this interpretation together.
Why are nations in an uproar? And why would peoples plot emptiness? Why would earthly kings take a stand? And why have rulers conspired together against the Lord and against his anointed one? Let's tear off their bonds and throw their ropes away from us. The one enthroned in the heavens laughs. The Lord mocks them. Then he speaks to them in his anger and dismays them in his wrath. But I have poured out my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will tell about the decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. I hereby father you today. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your property. You will crush them with an iron scepter. You will smash them like clay pottery." And now, kings, wise up Accept discipline, earthly rulers. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, or else he will become angry and you will perish in your way, for his anger quickly ignites. Happy are all who take refuge in him.